The lawyer's phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was elbow-deep in transmission fluid, and the first words out of his mouth were that my Uncle Theodore had died and left me 1,300 acres in rural Georgia. I dropped my wrench. "I'm sorry, did you say 1,300 acres?" I asked, wiping my hands on an already filthy rag. "My name is Nathan Sterling, and up until that moment I'd been a 32-year-old mechanic in Columbus, Ohio, living paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment that smelled like old socks and takeout containers." "Yes, Mr. Sterling, your great-uncle Theodore Harrington owned substantial property in Willow County, Georgia, about 40 miles southwest of Macon. The estate is quite sizable. We'll need you to come down to finalize the paperwork and discuss the details of the inheritance." I barely remembered Uncle Theodore. He'd been my grandmother's brother, a reclusive old man who'd visited maybe twice when I was a kid. I remembered him as tall and quiet, with weathered hands and a way of looking at you like he could see straight through to your thoughts. My grandmother had mentioned he owned some land down south, but I'd figured it was maybe a few acres, not enough to matter. 3 days later, I was driving my beat-up Ford pickup down Interstate 75, watching Ohio's gray winter fade into Kentucky's rolling hills and then Tennessee's mountains before finally crossing into Georgia. The lawyer, a man named Richard Pemberton, had his office in a small town called Henson Creek, population 4,200 according to the faded sign at the town limits. Pemberton's office sat above a hardware store on Main Street. He was a thin man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He shook my hand with a firm grip and gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. "Mr. Sterling, I'm glad you could make it down. Let me start by saying your great-uncle was a fascinating man. Very private, very careful about his affairs. He left everything to you, his only living relative, once your grandmother passed. I still don't understand. 1,300 acres? That's like 2 square miles of land. What was he doing with all that?" Pemberton pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across his desk. "Your uncle purchased the land over 40 years ago, back in 1985. It was mostly forest and unused farmland at the time. He lived in a cabin near the eastern edge of the property, kept to himself, paid his taxes, never caused any trouble. And now it's mine, every acre. But there's a complication you should be aware of." Pemberton pulled out a survey map and turned it toward me. "About 15 years ago, a development company built a residential community called Pinecrest Estates on the western portion of what they believed was county land. They constructed 47 homes, clubhouse, pool facilities, and associated infrastructure." I stared at the map, my brain struggling to process what he was saying. "On my uncle's land, on your land now, yes, the development company, Meridian Homes, apparently relied on a faulty survey from the 1970s that incorrectly placed the property boundaries. Your uncle was aware of the development but never said anything, never approached them, never signed any lease or agreement. He just let them build. Why would he do that?" Pemberton removed his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth from his pocket. "I asked him that once, about 5 years ago when I brought it up. He just smiled and said sometimes it's interesting to see how things play out. Your uncle was an odd man, Mr. Sterling. So what does this mean? Can they just stay there?" "That's the complicated part. Legally, they're trespassers. The entire development, every house, every street, the community buildings, all of it sits on your private property without any legal right to be there. No lease, no easement, no purchase agreement, nothing." My head was spinning. But people live there. They bought those houses. They bought houses on land they thought was properly zoned and owned by the development company. But the development company never owned the land. It's quite possibly one of the largest real estate blunders I've seen in my 40 years of practice. When it comes out, there will be lawsuits. Lots of them. Has anyone there realized? The people living in those houses? Not yet. The community is run by a homeowners association, quite a strict one from what I understand. They've been operating under the assumption everything is legitimate. Your uncle's property taxes are paid to a different district, and the paperwork has never crossed paths in any obvious way. But now that you're inheriting, the title search makes everything crystal clear. I sat back in the chair, my mind racing. 47 families living on my land without knowing it. What are my options? You could evict them, though that would be a legal nightmare and likely take years. You could negotiate some kind of lease arrangement, retroactive and going forward. You could sell them the land, though determining a fair price would be complicated. Or you could do nothing, like your uncle did, but I wouldn't recommend that. Now that you're aware of the situation, your liability increases significantly if anything happens on that property. I need to see it, the land, the development, all of it. Pemberton nodded. I expected you'd say that. I've arranged for us to drive out tomorrow morning if you're available. For tonight, I've booked you a room at the Magnolia Inn here in town. That night, I lay awake in a room that smelled like lavender air freshener, staring at the ceiling and trying to wrap my head around the situation. 1,300 acres, an entire neighborhood built on my property. It felt surreal, like something from a movie rather than my actual life. The next morning, Pemberton drove us out in his Buick sedan. We left town on a 2-lane highway that cut through pine forests and the occasional clear cut. After about 20 minutes, he turned onto a smaller road, barely more than packed dirt, and we bounced along for another mile before he pulled over. The property line starts here, he said, pointing to a rusty metal marker barely visible in the undergrowth, and extends in basically every direction for quite a distance. We got out and walked into the woods. The morning air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. Birds called from the canopy above. After about 10 minutes of hiking, I started to hear sounds of civilization, a dog barking, the distant hum of a lawnmower, children's voices. We emerged from the tree line at the top of a small ridge, and below us spread Pinecrest Estates. It looked like any suburban development you'd see anywhere in America. Neat rows of houses with vinyl siding and 2-car garages, curved streets with names like Oakmont Drive and Willowbrook Lane, sidewalks where someone was walking a golden retriever. In the center, I could see a large clubhouse with a parking lot, and beyond that, the blue rectangle of a swimming pool. 47 homes, Pemberton said quietly. Property values probably between $200,000 and $300,000 each. About 120 people living here full-time, and they have no idea. None whatsoever. We walked down the ridge and onto one of the streets. A woman in her 50s was getting her mail, and she smiled and waved at us. "Good morning. Are you gentlemen lost?" "Just looking around," Pemberton replied pleasantly. "Beautiful neighborhood." "It certainly is. We love it here. Very well maintained, very safe. The HOA makes sure everything stays perfect." She said this last part with a kind of pride that struck me as odd. We continued walking. Every lawn was immaculate, every house painted in approved neutral tones. There were no boats in driveways, no basketball hoops over garage doors, no cars on blocks. It looked like a photograph from a real estate brochure, almost too perfect to be real. "The HOA is quite strict," Pemberton murmured as we walked. "I've heard stories. Fines for grass being a 1/4 inch too tall, approved paint colors only, no parking on the street after 9 p.m. That sort of thing." As if summoned by his words, a golf cart came whirring up the street toward us. Behind the wheel sat a woman with blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, wearing a white polo shirt with an embroidered logo that read Pinecrest HOA Board President. She pulled up alongside us and got out, her smile bright but her eyes hard. "Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Patricia Whitmore, HOA President. I don't believe I recognize you. Are you visiting one of our residents?" "Just taking a look around," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "It's a nice community." "It certainly is, and we work hard to keep it that way. Of course, we have rules about visitors. All guests need to be registered with the main office, and you'll need to display a visitor pass in your vehicle." "Where are you parked?" "We walked in," I said. Her smile tightened. "Walked in from where?" "From the east," Pemberton said smoothly. "We're just doing a bit of surveying for a client, nothing that affects the neighborhood." "Well, I'll need to see your permits. Any surveying work near Pinecrest Estates requires HOA approval. It's in our bylaws, Section 7, Paragraph 3. I felt a flash of irritation. This woman was standing on my land, telling me I needed permission to be here, but I bit my tongue. Now wasn't the time to drop that particular bomb. "We're not surveying the neighborhood, madam," I said, "just the surrounding area. We won't bother anyone. I'll need your names and contact information for our records." "That won't be necessary," Pemberton said, his lawyer voice coming out. We're on public property conducting legitimate business. Have a good day, Ms. Whitmore. We walked away before she could respond, but I could feel her eyes boring into my back. When we were out of earshot, Pemberton chuckled dryly. That's Patricia Whitmore. She's run this HOA with an iron fist for the past 8 years. Some call her the Queen of Pinecrest, though not to her face. She's been known to fine people for having the wrong shade of beige on their mailbox. She seems like a piece of work. You have no idea. But she's also the person you'll likely be negotiating with when this all comes out. She's not going to take it well. We spent another hour walking around the property, and I started to get a sense of the scale. The development took up maybe 50 acres of the 1,300 I'd inherited. The rest was forest, rolling hills, a couple of small creeks, and in the distance, the cabin where Uncle Theodore had lived. "Can we see the cabin?" I asked. Pemberton drove us around the perimeter of the development on old logging roads that had been there long before the neighborhood. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by oak trees, a simple structure of weathered wood with a stone chimney and a covered porch. It looked like something from another century, a deliberate rejection of modernity. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. Someone had been maintaining it, probably Pemberton's office. There was a wood stove, a simple kitchen, a bedroom with an iron frame bed, and a living area with bookshelves lining every wall. I walked along the shelves, reading titles, history, philosophy, poetry, field guides to birds and plants, technical manuals on forestry and land management. On a desk by the window, I found a journal. I opened it and saw my uncle's handwriting, neat and precise. "May I?" I asked Pemberton. "It's yours now. Everything here is." I flipped through the pages. Most entries were observations about the land, which trees were thriving, where he'd seen deer, notes about soil quality and water flow. But then I found an entry dated June 15, 2009. "They started clearing today. I heard the chainsaws from the ridge. Walked over and watched from the tree line, big machines, lots of workers. They're building houses where the old Hartley place used to be. On my land, I checked the surveys again, triple-checked. No question, they're trespassing. But I won't stop them. Let's see what happens. Let's see if anyone does their homework. Could be interesting." More entries followed, documenting the construction, the arrival of the first families, the establishment of the HOA. Uncle Theodore had watched it all like a scientist observing an experiment. The last entry was dated just 3 months before his death. The HOA president, Patricia, has started putting up signs about no trespassing in private property. The irony is delicious. She has no idea she's the trespasser. I won't be around much longer to see how this plays out, but I've left everything to Nathan. He's a good kid, or was when I knew him. Smart, fair. He'll do the right thing, whatever that turns out to be. I closed the journal, feeling a strange weight settle on my shoulders. Uncle Theodore had left me more than land. He'd left me a responsibility, a moral puzzle with no clear solution. "I want to stay here for a while," I told Pemberton, "in the cabin, get a feel for things before I make any decisions." "That's wise. The utilities are still connected. There's a generator for backup power. I'll have my office send over some supplies. How long are you thinking?" "I don't know yet. A few weeks, maybe longer. I need to figure this out." Pemberton nodded. "Take your time. But Mr. Sterling, you should know that word is going to get out eventually. This is a small county. Once people start talking, once someone pulls the right records at the courthouse, this whole situation is going to explode. You might want to have a plan in place before that happens." He left me there with a box of supplies from his trunk: coffee, canned goods, bread, eggs. After his car disappeared down the dirt road, I stood on the porch and listened to the silence. It was so different from Columbus, from the constant noise of the city. Here I could hear individual birds, the rustle of wind in the leaves, the distant rush of water from a creek. I spent the next week exploring the property, walking miles every day through forest and field. I found old stone walls marking property lines from a century ago, a collapsed barn that must have been from when this was farmland, deer trails and turkey scratches, and once, as in soft mud by a creek, the paw print of what I was pretty sure was a black bear. I also watched the neighborhood. Not in a creepy way, just observing from a distance, trying to understand what I was dealing with. I saw kids getting on school buses in the morning, saw people coming home from work in the evening, saw them walking dogs and jogging and washing cars. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that their entire existence here was built on a foundation of error. And I saw Patricia. She was everywhere, driving that golf cart around like a patrol vehicle, stopping to talk to residents, taking photos with her phone of apparent violations. I watched her leave a bright orange notice on someone's door, saw the person come out and read it and shake their head in frustration. On my 8th day at the cabin, I decided to walk into the neighborhood properly, to get a closer look. It was a Saturday morning, and the place was bustling. Someone was having a yard sale despite the HOA rules against it, though they'd apparently gotten approval because there was an official-looking permit taped to their mailbox. I was browsing a table of old tools when a man about my age approached me. He had a friendly face and a toddler on his hip. "Hey, I haven't seen you around before. Just move in?" "No, just visiting the area," I said, which was technically true. "Nice neighborhood." "Yeah, it's good. We've been here 3 years. My wife and I got a good deal on our place. The HOA can be a pain sometimes, but mostly it's pretty peaceful." He shifted the toddler to his other hip. "I'm Marcus, by the way. Nathan, you thinking about buying here?" "Maybe. Still exploring my options." "Well, if you do, just make sure you read the HOA bylaws carefully. They're not kidding around with the rules." My next-door neighbor got fined $300 because his garbage can was visible from the street for more than 2 hours after pickup. "That seems excessive. Tell me about it." But Patricia, the HOA president, she runs a tight ship. Some people love it, some people hate it. We just try to stay under the radar. We talked for a few more minutes before his wife called him back to their house. I bought an old hand plane from the yard sale, partly because I needed one, and partly to have an excuse for being there. As I was leaving, Patricia's golf cart appeared again. She pulled up next to me and got out. "You're back," she said, her voice carrying an edge. "The man from last week. Nathan, was it?" "That's right. Are you interested in purchasing property in Pinecrest Estates? Because I can connect you with our approved real estate agents. We have a very thorough vetting process for new residents." "I'm sure you do. But I'm not looking to buy. Then what exactly are you doing here? I've seen you walking around, talking to residents. If you're a salesman or solicitor, we have strict policies against that." "I'm not selling anything. Just getting to know the area." "Well, I'd appreciate it if you'd get to know the area outside of our community. This is private property, and we have a right to determine who is and isn't welcome here." The irony of her words almost made me laugh, but I kept my face neutral. "I understand. I'll be on my way. See that you are, and if I see you here again without a legitimate reason, I'll call the sheriff's department." I walked away, feeling her eyes on me until I disappeared back into the trees. My hands were clenched into fists, my jaw tight. The sheer audacity of this woman, threatening to have me arrested on my own land, was almost too much to bear. That night, I called Pemberton from the cabin's landline. "I think it's time," I said. "Time to let them know the situation." "Are you sure?" "Once this comes out, there's no putting it back in the box." "I'm sure. That woman threatened to have me arrested for trespassing on my own property. And more than that, these people deserve to know the truth. They bought houses thinking they had legitimate title. They need to know they don't. How do you want to handle it? What's the legal first step?" "Formally, you'd send a notice to the HOA and the development company, informing them that they're occupying your property without permission and giving them an opportunity to respond. After that, we can negotiate or litigate as needed. Then let's send the notice. Draft it up, make it clear and official. I want this out in the open. I'll have it ready by Monday. But Nathan, prepare yourself. This is going to get ugly." He wasn't wrong. The letter went out by certified mail on Monday to both the Pinecrest Estates HOA board and Meridian Homes, the development company. It laid out the facts clearly. I was the legal owner of the property. The development had been built without permission or lease, and all parties needed to contact my attorney to discuss resolution. The first response came within 48 hours. Meridian Homes' legal team sent a letter disputing the claim, insisting their surveys were accurate and their title was clear. They demanded I provide proof of ownership and suggested I was attempting some kind of fraud. The HOA's response came in person. I was on the cabin's porch Thursday afternoon when I heard vehicles approaching. 3 cars pulled into the clearing. Patricia's golf cart loaded onto a trailer behind her SUV and two other cars carrying what looked like the rest of the HOA board. 6 people in total got out and Patricia led the way. "Nathan Sterling," she called out, her voice sharp. "We need to talk now." I stood up from my chair and walked to the edge of the porch. "I'm Nathan Sterling." "What the hell do you think you're doing? Sending us that ridiculous letter, claiming you own Pinecrest Estates? This is harassment, and it's illegal. It's not a claim, it's a fact. This cabin sits on my property. Pinecrest Estates sits on my property. All of this land, 1,300 acres, belongs to me. I inherited it from my uncle, Theodore Harrington." One of the other board members, a heavy-set man in his 60s, stepped forward. "That's impossible. We have title insurance, surveys, legal documentation." Meridian Homes owned the land, then the HOA took over the common areas when they sold the lots. Meridian Homes never owned this land. They built on it based on a faulty survey from the 1970s. My uncle owned it then, and I own it now. My lawyer has all the documentation if you want to see it. "This is insane," Patricia said, her face flushing red. "You can't just show up and claim you own an entire neighborhood. That's not how property law works." Actually, it is exactly how property law works. The land was surveyed incorrectly. The development company never did proper due diligence. And my uncle never gave permission for any of this to be built. You're trespassers, all of you. "We'll sue you into oblivion," Patricia spat. "We have an entire community of homeowners, all with their own attorneys. We'll bury you in legal fees." I kept my voice calm, though my heart was pounding. "You can try, but the law is pretty clear. My uncle had title to this land long before Pinecrest Estates existed. The county records prove it. The original surveys prove it. You're welcome to check with your own lawyers, but they're going to tell you the same thing." Another board member, a woman with graying hair and worried eyes, spoke up. "If this is true, what happens to our homes, to our families? That's what we need to figure out. I'm not trying to throw anyone out, but we need to acknowledge reality and work out a solution that's fair to everyone." "Fair?" Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to talk about fair? We've built a community here. We've invested our lives, our savings, and you want to what? Extort rent from us? Force us to pay you for land we already own? You don't own it. You never did. That's the whole problem." "Get off our property," Patricia said, her voice low and dangerous. "Right now, before I call the sheriff and have you arrested for trespassing. This is my property. You're standing on my porch, on my land, threatening me. If anyone's going to call the sheriff, it should be me." For a moment, I thought Patricia might actually hit me. Her hands were clenched into fists, her whole body rigid with anger. But the man who'd spoken earlier put a hand on her shoulder. "Patricia, let's go. We need to talk to our lawyers, get the real story. Fighting here won't help anything." Slowly, reluctantly, she let him pull her away. The group retreated to their vehicles, but before getting in her SUV, Patricia turned back to me. "This isn't over, not by a long shot. You just declared war on the wrong community." They drove away in a cloud of dust, and I sat back down in my chair, my hands shaking slightly. I'd known it would be bad, but the raw hatred in Patricia's eyes had been something else entirely. I called Pemberton immediately. They came here. To the cabin. Patricia and the board. It got ugly. "Did they threaten you?" Patricia said I'd declared war. I don't think she meant it metaphorically. "I'll file for a restraining order if you want. Keep them away from the cabin." "No, not yet. Let's see how this plays out. But I'm keeping a record of everything from now on." Over the next week, the situation escalated rapidly. The story broke in the local newspaper, the Willow County Herald, with the headline, "Land Dispute Threatens Pinecrest Estates." Suddenly, everyone in the county knew about it. I started getting calls from reporters, real estate agents, even a producer from a true crime podcast who wanted to cover the story. I also started getting hate mail. Someone left a dead animal on the cabin's porch. My truck's tires were slashed one night while I was sleeping. I installed security cameras and started sleeping with my phone next to the bed. But not everyone in Pinecrest Estates was hostile. A few residents reached out through Pemberton's office asking for private meetings. The first was Marcus, the man I'd met at the yard sale. He came to the cabin on a Tuesday evening, looking nervous and exhausted. "My wife wanted me to come talk to you," he said, sitting across from me at the small kitchen table. We don't know what to believe anymore. The HOA says you're lying, trying to scam us. But we looked up the records ourselves, and they're saying you might be telling the truth. I am telling the truth. I didn't ask for this situation any more than you did. What do you want? From us, I mean. Are you going to make us leave? I'd been thinking about this question constantly since sending the letter. No, I don't want anyone to lose their home. But the legal reality is that you're living on my land without any agreement in place. We need to fix that. How? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Maybe long-term leases at reasonable rates. Maybe selling portions of the land to the homeowners at fair prices. Maybe some combination, but it has to be done legally with proper documentation. Marcus ran his hands through his hair. We paid $260,000 for our house 3 years ago. We're teachers. We don't have money to pay rent on top of our mortgage, and we definitely can't afford to buy the land separately. I know, and I'm not trying to gouge anyone, but I also can't just pretend I don't own the land. That would create liability issues, tax issues, all kinds of problems. Patricia's telling everyone you're going to demand millions, that you're planning to evict us all and redevelop the land for condos or something. Patricia doesn't know what she's talking about. She's angry and scared and she's lashing out. But I'm not the enemy here. We talked for another hour. Marcus left looking slightly less worried but still uncertain. I felt for him and everyone else in his position. They'd been caught in the middle through no fault of their own. 2 days later, I got a visit from someone else, a representative from Meridian Homes, the development company. His name was Douglas Fletcher, and he arrived in a Mercedes wearing a suit that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. Mr. Sterling, I'll be direct with you. My company made a mistake, a significant one. Our surveyors relied on outdated documentation, and we failed to do proper title research before beginning construction. That's on us. It's refreshing to hear someone actually admit it. However, we have a problem. If this becomes public knowledge, if it goes through the courts, my company will face massive liability. Lawsuits from every homeowner, probably regulatory fines, reputational damage. It could sink us entirely. And I'd like to propose a solution that benefits everyone. We'll purchase the 50 acres that Pinecrest Estates occupies, plus another 50 acres as a buffer for fair market value. We'll pay all legal fees, set up proper title for every homeowner, and handle all the paperwork. Everyone wins. What's fair market value? We're prepared to offer $2 million. I almost laughed. 50 acres of developed land with an entire neighborhood on it, and you want to pay $2 million? That's $40,000 an acre. The homes alone are worth over $10 million total. Fletcher's expression didn't change. The land without the development would be worth maybe $5,000 an acre for rural Georgia acreage. We built the improvements. We added the value. On my land. Without permission. You don't get credit for trespassing. Mr. Sterling, be reasonable. You could tie this up in court for years and spend hundreds of thousands on legal fees. Or you can take a generous offer and walk away wealthy. $2 million isn't generous, and it's not wealthy, not for what you're asking. What number would you consider fair? I'd been thinking about this too. $8 million for the land under the development, plus all legal fees. The homeowners get clear title to their lots included in that price. You absorb the cost of fixing your mistake. Fletcher's jaw tightened. That's absurd. We'd lose money on every house we sold. Then you should have done better due diligence before you built. This is your problem, not mine. $8 million is my offer. Take it or leave it. I'll have to discuss with my board, but I can tell you right now they won't go for it. Then I guess I'll see you in court. He left angry, and I sat on the porch wondering if I'd made a mistake. $8 million was a number I'd pulled partially from research and partially from gut instinct. Was it too much? Not enough? I had no real frame of reference for this kind of negotiation. That weekend, things took a darker turn. I was in town getting supplies when I overheard a conversation at the hardware store. 2 men were talking in the next aisle, and I heard my name. That Sterling guy thinks he can just kick people out of their homes. Someone ought to teach him a lesson. Patricia says we need to take a stand. Show him he can't mess with Pinecrest. What's she planning? Meeting tomorrow night at the clubhouse. Board members only, but word is she's got something big planned. I left the store and immediately called Pemberton.
They're planning something.
I don't know what, but I overheard people talking. There's a meeting tomorrow night. Do you feel unsafe at the cabin? I've got the security cameras up, but yeah, I'm a little concerned. Come stay in town for a few days, get a hotel room, let things cool down. If I leave, they might trash the place, or worse. Then I'm filing for that restraining order today. And I'm calling the sheriff's office, letting them know there might be trouble. The next day, a deputy came out to the cabin. His name was Rodriguez, and he seemed sympathetic but limited in what he could do. Mr. Sterling, I understand you're concerned, but unless someone makes a specific threat or commits a crime, there's not much we can do. We'll increase patrols in the area, and I've got your number if you need to call. But I can't arrest people for having a meeting, even if they're planning something illegal. Do you have proof they're planning something illegal? Actual evidence? No. Just overheard conversation and a gut feeling. Then my hands are tied. But keep me in the loop, okay? If anything happens, anything at all, you call immediately. That night I stayed awake watching the security camera feeds on my laptop. Around 10 p.m. I saw headlights in the distance. Then more. A convoy of vehicles was approaching the cabin. I grabbed my phone and called 911. This is Nathan Sterling at the old Harrington property. There are multiple vehicles approaching my cabin. I feel threatened. I need police assistance immediately. The dispatcher told me units were on the way, to stay inside and stay safe. I watched the screens as about 20 vehicles pulled into the clearing around the cabin. People got out, many carrying flashlights, some carrying signs. Patricia was at the front of the crowd. They started chanting, "Leave our homes alone, leave our homes alone." Then someone threw something at the cabin. I heard glass shatter, saw liquid splash across the front window. The smell of gasoline hit me immediately. "They're throwing Molotov cocktails," I shouted into the phone, which was still connected to dispatch. "They're trying to burn down the cabin with me in it." I ran to the back door as more bottles shattered against the front of the cabin. Flames were starting to spread across the porch. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the kitchen and sprayed the back door area, then kicked it open and ran out into the darkness. Behind me, the cabin was catching fire. The crowd out front was still chanting, seemingly unaware or uncaring that their protest had turned into arson. I ran into the woods, putting distance between myself and the chaos, my heart hammering in my chest. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. I pulled out my phone and called Rodriguez directly. They firebombed the cabin. I'm in the woods east of the clearing. The cabin's on fire and they're still there. Stay hidden. We're almost there. Multiple units responding. I crouched behind a fallen tree and watched as sheriff's department vehicles converged on the clearing, their lights painting the trees red and blue. The crowd scattered, people running back to their vehicles, but the deputies were blocking the only road out. There was nowhere for them to go. The fire department arrived and started battling the blaze. I walked back toward the clearing, stepping out of the woods with my hands visible. Rodriguez saw me and hurried over. "Are you hurt?" "No. I got out in time, but they tried to kill me. They threw gasoline bombs at the cabin while I was inside. We've got them contained. Stay here while we sort this out." Watched as deputies went through the crowd, checking IDs, taking statements. Patricia was arguing loudly with one officer, insisting she had nothing to do with the violence, that it was just supposed to be a peaceful protest. But the security cameras had caught everything, and I had the footage automatically uploading to cloud storage. When Rodriguez looked at the video on my phone, his expression turned grim. That's Patricia Whitmore throwing the first bottle, clear as day. And there's at least 5 others who threw them too. Arrests were made. Patricia, still protesting her innocence, was handcuffed and put in a patrol car along with 6 other people. They were charged with arson, criminal trespassing, attempted assault, and a handful of other crimes. The fire department managed to save part of the cabin, but the front half was destroyed. The smell of smoke and burned wood hung heavy in the air. I sat on the tailgate of a fire truck, wrapped in a blanket someone had given me, watching the sun come up over the scene of destruction. Pemberton arrived at dawn, looking disheveled and worried. "Nathan, thank God you're all right." I heard it on the police scanner. "They tried to burn me alive over property lines and HOA dues. Patricia and the others are going to jail. Arson is a serious felony, especially with you inside. they're looking at years in prison. What about everyone else? The people who didn't throw the bombs? That depends on what they knew and when. If this was planned, if there's evidence of conspiracy, more people might face charges. The sheriff's department is investigating. Over the next few days, the story exploded. National news picked it up. HOA president arrested for arson in land dispute. Patricia's mugshot was everywhere, her face angry and defiant. The other 6 arrested were identified as HOA board members or vocal supporters. I moved into a hotel in Henson Creek while the investigation continued. Detectives interviewed me multiple times, went through my security footage frame by frame, collected evidence from the cabin. They found messages in a group chat between Patricia and the others, showing they'd planned to scare me into leaving, though the messages stopped short of explicitly calling for violence. But intent didn't matter much when you threw a firebomb at an occupied building. The prosecutor was pursuing the charges aggressively. Meanwhile, the residents of Pinecrest Estates were in chaos. With the HOA leadership in jail, no one knew who was in charge or what was happening with the property dispute. Some people were trying to sell their homes and get out, but who would buy a house with unclear title? Others were organizing, trying to figure out how to negotiate with me directly. Marcus reached out again, this time representing a group of about 30 homeowners who wanted to find a solution. "We're not all like Patricia," he said when we met at a diner in town. "Most of us just want to live our lives, raise our kids, not get caught up in this nightmare. What can we do to make this right? I want what I said before: legal documentation, clear title, fair arrangements. I don't want to punish people who didn't do anything wrong." What about the people who were at the cabin that night but didn't throw anything? There are probably 15 people who drove out there for the protest but left when things got violent. If they didn't commit crimes, they don't have anything to worry about from me. The sheriff's department will sort out who did what. And the property itself? Can we work something out? I'd been refining my thoughts over the past week. Here's what I'm thinking. For people who want to stay long-term, I'll offer 99-year leases at reasonable rates, something that reflects actual land value but isn't going to bankrupt anyone. For people who want to own outright, I'll sell the individual lots at fair market value for raw land, not developed land. You already paid for the house, so you shouldn't have to pay inflated prices for the dirt under it. What kind of numbers are we talking about? I'm thinking lease payments around $200 a month per lot, or purchase prices around $30,000 for a quarter-acre lot. That's based on comparable rural land prices in the area. Marcus did the math in his head. That's actually reasonable, more than reasonable, honestly. I was expecting you to demand way more. I'm not trying to get rich off this, I just want to make sure everything is legal and fair. And I need to cover the cost of fixing the cabin and dealing with all these legal fees. What about the common areas? The clubhouse, the pool, the parks? Those would stay as shared spaces maintained by the homeowners who want to participate. I'll lease that land to a new HOA, assuming you can form one without Patricia at the helm. What about Meridian Homes? Are you still negotiating with them? Their $2 million offer is off the table after this. They're partly responsible for this whole mess. If they want to make things right, they need to step up. News of my proposed terms spread quickly through Pinecrest Estates. The response was mixed. Some people thought I was being generous, others thought I was still gouging them for land they believed should be theirs anyway. But mostly, people seemed relieved that I wasn't trying to evict everyone or demand impossible sums. Meridian Homes came back with a new offer: $5 million for the developed land, plus funding for rebuilding the cabin and covering my legal fees. I countered with $7 million, and after a week of negotiation, we settled on $6.5 million. They would handle setting up clear title for all existing homeowners who wanted to purchase their lots at my offered price, and they'd absorb the administrative costs. The legal process took months. Patricia and 4 others who'd thrown the firebombs were convicted of arson and attempted assault. Patricia got 8 years in prison. The others got between 4 and 6 years. The people who'd participated in the protest but not the violence got probation and fines. The civil side was equally complicated. Every homeowner had to make a choice: lease, purchase, or sell and leave. About 40 of the 47 families chose to purchase their lots. 3 chose long-term leases. 4 decided to sell and move away, unable to get past the stigma and stress of the whole situation. I used part of the settlement money to rebuild the cabin, this time with better materials and modern safety features, while keeping the aesthetic Uncle Theodore had created. I also set up a conservation easement on the remaining 1,200 acres, ensuring most of the land would stay undeveloped and wild. The whole process took nearly 2 years to fully resolve. During that time, I split my time between Georgia and Ohio, eventually deciding to make Georgia my permanent home. There was something about the land that had gotten into my blood, the same way it must have for Uncle Theodore. I visited Patricia in prison once, about a year after her conviction. I'm not sure why I went. Curiosity, maybe, or a need for closure. She looked older, worn down by incarceration. When she sat across from me in the visiting room, her eyes held none of the fire they'd had during our confrontations. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice flat. "I don't really know. I guess I wanted to understand why you did it, why you tried to kill me over a property dispute." She was quiet for a long time. I built that community. Not physically, but in every other way. I created the rules, maintained the standards, made sure everything was perfect. It was mine in every way that mattered. And you showed up out of nowhere and took it all away. I didn't take anything that was yours. It was always mine, legally. You just didn't know it. The law doesn't always reflect reality. We lived there, we paid for those houses, we built our lives there. That should have meant something. It did mean something. That's why I worked with people instead of just evicting everyone. But you didn't give me a chance to do that. You went straight to violence. I know. She looked down at her hands. I was so angry. I thought if we scared you enough, you'd just go away. I didn't think about the consequences, about what could actually happen. And when that first bottle hit and the fire started, it was like watching a nightmare unfold. But I couldn't stop it. Yes, you could have. You could have stopped at any point. Maybe. But I didn't. She looked up at me. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not just about getting caught, actually sorry. You could have died, and it would have been my fault. I have to live with that. I left the prison feeling oddly hollow. Her apology didn't change anything, didn't undo the trauma or the damage. But maybe it was something. Back in Pinecrest Estates, now officially and legally Pinecrest Estates subdivision with proper title and documentation, life had mostly returned to normal. A new HOA had been formed, this one with term limits and strict oversight to prevent another Patricia situation. The rules were still there, but enforced with more reasonableness and less tyranny. Marcus and his family were still there, and we'd become friends of a sort. He and some of the other homeowners helped me finish rebuilding the cabin, and in return, I let their kids explore the woods and taught them about the wildlife and plants Uncle Theodore had documented so carefully. I found myself becoming something like a steward of the land, the role Uncle Theodore must have seen for me when he left me the inheritance. I monitored the forest health, managed controlled burns to prevent wildfires, worked with state wildlife agencies to protect habitat for endangered species. And I thought a lot about the strange chain of events that had led me here. A faulty survey from 1970, Uncle Theodore buying the land in 1985, a development company's failure to do proper research, 47 families building their lives on a mistake, my inheritance bringing it all crashing down. What was the right thing to do in a situation like that? Was there even a right thing, or just a series of less wrong choices? I'd tried to be fair, to balance my legal rights with the human reality of people who'd done nothing wrong. I'd accepted less money than I could have demanded, structured deals that prioritized stability over profit. But I'd also enforced my ownership, refused to simply walk away from 1,300 acres because acknowledging it was inconvenient. Uncle Theodore had left me a moral puzzle, and I'd solved it the best I could. Whether that solution was right or wrong, I might never fully know. But I could live with the choices I'd made, and that had to be enough. The land stretched out around me, forest and field, and the small cluster of houses that now sat here legally, with proper documentation and clear title. The sun set over the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I sat on the cabin's new porch, Uncle Theodore's journal open in my lap, and read his final entry again. He'll do the right thing. whatever that turns out to be. I hoped he'd be proud of how I'd handled it. I hoped the families who stayed felt they'd been treated fairly. I hoped Patricia, sitting in her prison cell, understood that violence was never the answer to a legal dispute. Mostly, though, I hoped that the next survey would be accurate, that the next development would do proper research, and that no one else would inherit a problem like this one. But knowing human nature and the complexity of property law, I wasn't holding my breath. A deer emerged from the tree line in the distance, followed by 2 fawns. They grazed peacefully in the clearing where I'd once watched Patricia's mob gather. Life moved on, mistakes were corrected, and the land remained, patient and enduring, long after human dramas had faded. I closed the journal and went inside to make dinner, feeling, for the first time since that phone call in the Columbus garage 2 years ago, truly at home. The story of the Pinecrest Estates land dispute became something of a legend in Willow County. Law schools used it as a case study in property law. Title insurance companies referenced it in training materials about the importance of thorough research. And in real estate circles throughout Georgia, it became shorthand for doing your due diligence. Make sure you don't pull a Pinecrest. For me, it became the foundation of a new life. I never went back to the garage in Columbus, never returned to the studio apartment that smelled like old socks. I sold what little I'd owned there and made the cabin my permanent residence. I also started a small consulting business, helping landowners and developers navigate complex property issues. My experience with the Pinecrest situation gave me a unique perspective, and word spread that I was someone who could help untangle messy land disputes. One of my first clients was a family in Alabama who discovered that their subdivision had been built partially on state land due to a boundary error from the 1950s. Using lessons from my own experience, I helped them negotiate with the state and the homeowners to resolve the situation without anyone losing their homes or facing legal action. It felt good to use what I'd learned to help others avoid the kind of chaos Pinecrest had gone through. The civil lawsuits took even longer to fully resolve than the criminal cases. Multiple homeowners sued Meridian Homes for fraud and negligence. The title insurance companies got involved, arguing about what they did and didn't cover. It was a massive legal tangle that took 3 years to fully settle. In the end, Meridian Homes paid out over $20 million in settlements and legal fees. They didn't go bankrupt, but they came close. The company restructured, changed management, and implemented new protocols for surveying and title research. Their new marketing materials emphasized their rigorous due diligence process, a direct response to the Pinecrest disaster. The 4 families who chose to sell their homes eventually found buyers, though they had to accept lower prices than they'd hoped for, given all the negative publicity. I helped where I could, agreeing to seller financing in one case and reducing the land purchase price in another to make the numbers work. The 3 families who chose long-term leases instead of purchasing seemed happy with the arrangement. The monthly payments were low enough to be manageable, and the 99-year terms meant they effectively had permanent tenure without the upfront capital cost. As for the 40 families who purchased their lots, most seemed satisfied with the outcome. They'd paid more than they'd expected when they originally bought their homes, but less than if they'd tried to buy comparable property today. And now they had clear, unambiguous title, properly recorded with the county, no clouds or questions. The new HOA functioned much better than the old one. Without Patricia's iron grip, the community found a balance between maintaining standards and allowing people to actually live their lives. Grass could be 2 inches tall instead of exactly 1.5 inches. You could park on the street after 9 p.m. if you had guests. Kids could draw on the sidewalks with chalk without triggering a fine. The clubhouse hosted movie nights and potlucks. The pool was popular in summer. Neighbors actually talked to each other without worrying about reporting violations. It became the kind of community people had thought they were buying into before Patricia had turned it into a surveillance state. I was invited to some of the community events and usually went when I could. It was strange at first, socializing with people who lived on my land, but over time it just became normal. They were my neighbors, in a sense, even if the legal relationship was different from a typical neighborhood. The kids especially took to the arrangement. I let them use parts of the undeveloped land for hiking and exploring, taught them how to identify animal tracks and edible plants, showed them the creek where I'd found that black bear print. Some of them started referring to me as Mr. Nathan, the Forest guys, which made me laugh. One teenager, a kid named Jesse, whose family had been at the yard sale where I'd met Marcus, got particularly interested in ecology and land management. He started coming to the cabin regularly after school, helping me with small projects and asking endless questions about wildlife and conservation. "Why did you keep so much of the land undeveloped?" he asked one afternoon while we were repairing a hiking trail. "You could have sold it all, made way more money." "Money's not everything," I said. "This land has been here for thousands of years. It'll be here long after I'm gone." My uncle understood that. He could have developed it or sold it any time, but he chose to protect it. "I'm just continuing what he started. But you could have been like really rich. I am rich. I have land, clean air, forest full of wildlife. I wake up every morning to birdsong instead of traffic. That's worth more than any amount of money to me." He thought about that while we worked. That's cool, I guess. Different, but cool. I thought Uncle Theodore would have liked Jesse. He had that same curiosity, that same instinct to look beyond the obvious to the deeper patterns underneath. The criminal appeals took years as well. Patricia's lawyers argued everything they could think of: temporary insanity, inadequate counsel, disproportionate sentencing. None of it worked. The evidence was too clear, the crime too serious. She'd thrown a firebomb at an occupied building, and all the legal maneuvering in the world couldn't change that fact. Two of the others who'd been convicted did get their sentences reduced slightly, on appeal, from 6 years to 4 years, based on arguments that they'd been following Patricia's lead and hadn't fully understood what they were doing. The courts bought it for them, but not for Patricia herself, who, as the HOA president and clear instigator, got no leniency. I followed the appeals out of a sense of needing to see it through to the end, but I didn't attend any of the hearings. I'd said what I needed to say during the trial, and going to every proceeding would just keep me stuck in that moment, unable to move forward. Instead, I focused on building a life in Georgia. I dated a few people, nothing serious at first, but eventually met someone who fit. Her name was Miranda Phillips, and she was a park ranger at a state forest about 30 miles from my property. We met at a land management conference and bonded over our shared love of conservation and our mutual frustration with people who left trash in the wilderness. Miranda understood the appeal of the cabin and the land in a way that few people did. She'd grown up in rural Montana and had that same connection to wild places that Uncle Theodore had cultivated, and I was learning. We started spending more and more time together, and eventually she moved into the cabin with me. "You sure you want to live with the guy who had a whole HOA try to burn him alive?" I asked when she suggested it. "Are you kidding? That's the most interesting thing about you." "Well, that and the 1,300 acres. She brought her dog, a border collie mix named Scout, who loved exploring the property as much as we did. The cabin, which had felt a bit lonely when it was just me, suddenly felt like a real home. We got married on a ridge overlooking Pinecrest Estates 2 years after Patricia went to prison. Marcus and his family came, along with several other residents. Miranda's family flew in from Montana. Pemberton officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. "I've officiated a lot of ceremonies," he said during the reception, "but this is the first one on disputed land that's now been properly surveyed and legally documented." Everyone laughed, but there was truth in the joke. The land dispute had brought me to Georgia, had forced me to examine questions of ownership and fairness and community. And somehow, through all the chaos and conflict, I'd found a life that felt meaningful in ways my old one never had. Miranda and I started a nonprofit focused on conservation education, using part of my land as a teaching site. We brought in school groups, taught workshops on ecology and land stewardship, worked with the county to establish hiking trails in protected areas. The organization grew slowly but steadily, funded by donations and grants and a portion of the income from the Pinecrest leases and land sales. Jesse, the teenager who'd helped me with trail work, ended up going to college for environmental science. He credited our conversations as inspiring his career choice, which made me feel like I was honoring Uncle Theodore's legacy in ways beyond just owning the land. Patricia got out of prison after serving 6 years of her 8-year sentence, released early for good behavior. I heard she moved to Florida, wanted to get as far from Georgia as possible. I never heard from her directly, never got another apology or explanation. In a way, I was glad. That chapter was closed and reopening it would serve no purpose. The others who'd been convicted served their time and drifted back into regular life. One moved away. 2 stayed in the area but not in Pinecrest Estates. The community had moved on, and there was no place for them in the new version of the neighborhood they'd tried to defend through violence. Meridian Homes eventually recovered from their legal and financial troubles. They're still building developments, but now they're known for being almost obsessively careful about surveys and title research. Every property gets checked and double-checked and checked again. The Pinecrest disaster was expensive enough that they never wanted to risk a repeat. The title insurance industry also changed some of its practices in response to the case. Coverage limits increased, research protocols tightened, and new training programs emphasized the importance of historical surveys and boundary verification. One insurance company executive told me at a conference that Pinecrest had been a wake-up call for the entire industry. I kept Uncle Theodore's journal on a shelf in the cabin, and sometimes I'd pull it out and read through his observations. His writing had a clarity and patience that I tried to emulate in my own work. He'd spent decades watching and learning, understanding the land and the slow rhythms of forest life. One entry, dated 5 years before the development started, stuck with me. Ownership is a strange concept. The county says I own this land, the deed says it's mine, but what does that really mean? I don't own the deer or the trees or the water in the creek. I'm just a temporary custodian, here for a brief moment in the land's long history. The best I can do is try not to damage it too badly before I pass it on to whoever comes next. I thought about that idea a lot. I did own the land, legally and practically, but Uncle Theodore was right that it was temporary. Someday I'd die, and the land would pass to someone else. Maybe to kids Miranda and I might have, maybe to a conservation organization, maybe to someone I hadn't even met yet. The important thing was to leave it better than I'd found it, to be a good custodian during my brief time as owner. That meant protecting the forest, maintaining the trails, working with the families in Pinecrest Estates to ensure their homes remained stable and secure. It also meant being open about the history. When school groups came for education programs, I told them the whole story, the faulty survey, the unauthorized development, the conflict, the violence, the resolution. I didn't shy away from the difficult parts or pretend it had been easy. Land disputes are complicated, I'd tell them. There's legal ownership and moral responsibility and human needs all tangled together. Sometimes there's no perfect solution, just the best compromise you can manage. The kids always had questions. Were you scared when they threw the fire? Did you want revenge? Do you wish your uncle had stopped them from building in the first place? I answered honestly, yes, I was terrified. No, I didn't want revenge, just fairness and safety. And as for whether Uncle Theodore should have stopped the development, I'd come to believe his choice to observe rather than intervene had been deliberate and maybe even wise. If he'd immediately confronted Meridian Homes, the dispute would have played out decades earlier, probably with even worse outcomes. By waiting, by documenting, by leaving it to me, he'd given everyone time to invest in the community and build lives there, which made finding a humane solution more important and ultimately more possible. 10 years after inheriting the land, I stood on the same ridge where Miranda and I had gotten married. Pinecrest Estates spread out below, houses neat and well-maintained, kids playing in the street, someone grilling in their backyard. It looked peaceful, normal, like any suburban neighborhood anywhere. But I knew the history beneath that normalcy, the layers of mistakes and conflict and resolution that had shaped this place. The land remembered even if the people didn't. The property markers I'd had surveyed and installed were still there, properly located now, marking boundaries that everyone understood and agreed to. Scout ran past chasing a squirrel, and Miranda came up beside me, slipping her hand into mine. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Just how strange life is. 10 years ago, I was broke mechanic in Ohio with no prospects. Now I'm here, with you with all this land running a conservation nonprofit. If my uncle hadn't died, If Pemberton hadn't called, none of this would exist. Do you ever miss your old life? Not even a little bit. That life was just killing time, waiting for something to happen. This life actually means something. We walked back toward the cabin as the sun set, painting the sky in colors Uncle Theodore had probably watched thousands of times from this same ridge. The land endured, patient and permanent, while human dramas played out across its surface like ripples on water. I'd inherited 1,300 acres and found an entire community sitting on it without permission. What could have been pure disaster, pure conflict, had somehow become something better. Not perfect, not without cost or pain, but workable. Human, and in the end that was all you could really ask for. A solution that acknowledged reality while still leaving room for compassion. Uncle Theodore had trusted me to find that balance, and I'd done my best. Whether he'd be proud or disappointed, I'd never know for certain, but I chose to believe he'd approve. The cabin's lights glowed warm in the gathering darkness as we approached. Inside, dinner was waiting, and tomorrow there'd be trail work to do, school groups to teach, and 100 small tasks that came with managing land and community. It was good work, meaningful work, the kind that left you tired but satisfied at the end of the day. I'd found my place, finally, in the aftermath of a survey error and an inheritance I'd never expected. And that place, it turned out, was exactly where I needed to be.